Good afternoon. This is Mariah McGill here. I am your TA and I am the guest lecturer for today's course, which is Class 11, International Approaches, the ILO, and CEDAW. So before we begin, I'd just like to do a wrap-up of Class 10. I thought there were some great answers to the discussion forums last week, particularly with regards to the ways in which globalization has impacted the economics and provision of care. Many of you noted that the ultimate beneficiaries of the new arrangements aren't children and mothers, but large corporations. I also enjoyed hearing about your childcare arrangements growing up and your ideas for childcare arrangements that would better support women working and realizing their economic potential. Many of you noted that men need to be more involved in childcare, but that changing entrenched gender roles may be difficult to do. So thank you for your really thoughtful and insightful discussion forum posts last week. So I'm going to begin with a brief introduction to the ILO. The ILO is a specialized agency that aims to promote social justice and universally recognized human rights, including the right to decent work for all. It was created in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, and it is the only worldwide organization that is founded on a tripartite structure that gives equal representation to workers, employers, and governments. The focus of the ILO's work is on setting international labor standards and technical cooperation. Setting those labor standards is primarily accomplished through a series of conventions that are first adopted at the ILO's annual International Labor Conference and are then ratified by member states. Because of the tripartite structure of the ILO conventions are drafted with input from workers, employers, and governments. The conventions are legally binding once they've been ratified by a member state, and the ILO also issues non-binding guidelines that supplement those conventions. So promoting gender equality has been a central part of the ILO's mission for decades, and there are 4 key gender equality conventions. The first is the Equal Remuneration Convention, Convention number 100, which mandates equal pay for men and women for the same value of work. The second is the Discrimination in Employment and Occupation Convention, which again prohibits discrimination against women in employment and occupation. And then the third is the Workers with Family Responsibilities Convention, which mandates that men and women with family responsibilities should not be discriminated against in the workplace because of their need to take care of those family responsibilities. And then the final one is the Maternity Protection Convention, which prohibits discrimination against pregnant women and mothers. So these conventions have been ratified by countries all over the world, but they have not yet been ratified by the United States. In addition to the ILO's traditional work in setting labor standards for women and gender equality, the ILO has also launched a new initiative in advance of the ILO's centenary in 2015, and that's the Women at Work initiative. So it aims to shine the spotlight on the issue of gender equality in the workplace. And some of the issues that the ILO has highlighted include the wage gap, as we've already talked about, job quality, the caring crisis, and violence against women. So now we'll turn to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is known as CEDAW. And so CEDAW Convention prohibits all forms of discrimination against women and girls, and I won't read the definition there, but you should read it at your leisure and really take a moment to review it and understand it, because it's different than how the United States typically thinks about discrimination in U.S. law. There are 3 principles of CEDAW, and the first is the principle of substantive, which is not the same as formal equality. CEDAW requires not merely that laws, policies, and programs be gender neutral, but that the outcomes of these laws, policies, and programs are equal for men and women. The second principle is the principle of non-discrimination. CEDAW requires states parties to ensure that laws, policies, and programs do not discriminate against women. And this principle covers not just state action, but also private actions as well. So again, this is different from U.S. law. And the final principle is the principle of state obligation. States parties have a 2-part obligation under CEDAW. The first is to put forth new laws and policies so that women's rights can be guaranteed in national legal frameworks. And the second is to take special measures to end de facto discrimination against women. And those special measures are often affirmative action policies that do, in the short term, benefit women because they're aimed at addressing decades, hundreds of years old discrimination against women with the goal of eventually having full gender equality. And so it's important to note again that these principles are very different from how we view discrimination in U.S. law. Typically, under U.S. system, laws and policies and programs that are gender neutral on their face are held to be valid provided there's not a discriminatory intent, even if there is discriminatory outcomes in practice. Under CEDAW, those discriminatory outcomes are forbidden even if there's no discriminatory intent. And so states have an affirmative obligation to address discrimination not just in law but also in fact. The other really important principle to know about CEDAW, and this principle is not just in CEDAW but in all UN conventions and documents, is the principle of progressive realization. So CEDAW is a legally binding document on the countries that have ratified it. However, states parties are not required to implement all aspects of the convention immediately. Instead, they are required under the principle of progressive realization to implement the convention gradually over time. And so what this recognizes is that it would be very difficult for any country in the world to immediately, overnight, ratify every aspect of the convention, but it requires them to continually strive to get to the point where all aspects are in fact implemented. And so what it does is it requires states parties to use the maximum of available resources to implement the convention, as well as to refrain from retrogressive measures that would undermine the purpose of the convention. And so a retrogressive measure is any measure adopted by the state that would move the country back from the implementation efforts that they've already achieved. So for example, if you had a national healthcare system that covered and fully funded birth control for women, and then the state announced that they were going to remove that birth control coverage after it had already been implemented, that would be an example of a retrogressive measure because it's pulling one piece of gender equality back, and that is forbidden under the CEDAW Convention. So the CEDAW Convention was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1979. It has been ratified by almost 200 countries. And in terms of the U.S., it was signed by President Jimmy Carter in 1980, but it has not yet been ratified by the U.S. Senate, and so it's therefore not legally binding in the United States. The U.S. is one of the only other countries in the world which has not ratified the convention. Other countries include Iran, Somalia, and Sudan. And so the bulk of your reading this week is going to be looking at the San Francisco CEDAW case study. While the U.S. has not ratified CEDAW, many communities across the country have attempted to ratify CEDAW on the local level. And the most notable of those examples actually is San Francisco, which was one of the first cities in the U.S. to attempt to implement CEDAW, and arguably one of the more successful. Other communities, including Boston, Massachusetts, and Portland, Oregon, have been inspired by this San Francisco example and have sought to implement CEDAW and other human rights treaties on a local level as well. And so this effort has been ongoing since 1998. The reading for this week only covers the first 10 years of the CEDAW implementation efforts, but if you wish to have more information on the current efforts, you can go to the San Francisco Department on the Status of Women and the Cities for CEDAW websites. So the assignments for the week are a short reading on the ILO's Women at Work initiative, a report on San Francisco's CEDAW implementation efforts, a short video on the history of gender equality at the ILO, and 3 short videos that further explain the CEDAW principles of non-discrimination, substantive equality, and state obligation. And so the discussion questions for the week are, first, the United States has not ratified the ILO Gender Equality Conventions nor the CEDAW Convention. Why do you think the U.S. has not ratified these conventions? And would life be different for women in the United States if these conventions were ratified, and how? Second, CEDAW defines equality and non-discrimination differently than U.S. law and requires states parties to protect women from discrimination from private as well as state actors. Do you agree or disagree with the CEDAW principles? Why and why not? And third, after reading the report on San Francisco's CEDAW implementation efforts, was there anything that surprised you about these local efforts? Do you think it has improved your quality of life as a San Francisco resident and student? So thanks very much. I hope you enjoy the materials this week, and I look forward to reading your discussion forum posts. Have a great day. Bye.